Good evening and welcome to the Burn Sheehan Tech Talks. Wow, what a world we're in at the moment. What a few weeks this has been. How the world has changed so dramatically in such a short space of time. I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on all our lives, both from a professional and a personal perspective. We're all definitely having to pivot and change and adapt pretty quickly here. What was business as usual in early March looks very, very different from business as usual today. So overnight, we've all become experts at juggling homeschooling, conducting work meetings and stand-ups and sprints. Beards and DIY haircuts are now the norm. And one of my main challenges in life is coming up with original quiz questions as we become a nation of quizzes. The way we engage with our internal and external communities has just transformed overnight. And we're trying to make things as normal as possible in what appears to be a very, very unnormal world. So today's topic is we're going to address a real and challenging immediate problem that a lot of businesses are facing right now. How to effectively onboard new starters while we all try and work remotely. I think we can all appreciate that sort of onboarding programs boost productivity, engagement, they help retention, and traditionally, organisations have invested huge amount of time and effort and resources to build world-class onboarding programs. Unfortunately, with COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown, this has left many of these programs obsolete and really not fit for purpose. So how can we do the right thing now by our new joiners? What can we do where once we had sort of office tours, starter lunches, meet and greets, those things are sort of a thing of the past a little bit, or certainly in the short term now. So what are we going to do? Well, to help us answer some of these questions and more importantly, to share their insights into what they are doing right now, we've got a panel of guests who are joining us who are living and breathing this. Firstly, we've got Matt Young from, Matt is the engineering manager of Gousto. Welcome, Matt.
Hi.
You're probably aware Gousto are a business which create recipe boxes that are delivered to our homes, and not surprisingly, they're having a huge surge in demand at this moment in time since the lockdown has been imposed. So looking forward to hearing Matt's thoughts on how they're overcoming some of the challenges at this moment in time. We've also got Joe Burrows. Welcome, Joe. Joe's part of the talent team at Trade.io. Trade are a Series C funded tech house who have built a cloud-based platform that allows them to automate complex work processes for some of the largest organizations in the world. They have extremely impressive client bases, and again, you know, coming to the fore at this particular time. Alongside Matt and Joe, we've got Charles Hyde from Experian, the FTSE 100 multinational innovation-led software vendor, and Charlie will give his insights into how they are onboarding their staff. They're a large multinational and probably have experience within the panel of actually doing some remote onboarding already, but they've certainly not completed that whole process through a virtual process until now, that is, of course. And then finally, we welcome James McVey. James has recently been hired by Gamesys, the FTSE 250 software development online gaming company. And James will share his positive experience of currently going through an onboarding process remotely. So welcome, guys. Hope you're all well and look forward to hearing your insights today. So first of all, thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening. Just quickly before we start, there's a few sort of housekeeping points. We will be recording this event. We will share the link with you all on social media post this event. We will also give you the opportunity to ask questions. So if you've got any insights that you want to share, anything that you want to ask the guys, then please do that through the chat function on the system. I'll try as best as possible to answer some of all the questions if you have them. And we will try and keep this to sort of 45 minutes to an hour tops. Okay, so let's sort of start. So firstly, good news, guys, you are working with the companies that are doing well in these difficult times. And you're a bit of a rare breed at this moment in time, that's without a doubt. So well done, first of all, for you for going through that. I'd like to sort of start with probably, you know, if you bear with me, before the onboarding process, and we'll just quickly look at some of the challenges that may have faced during the interview process. I'm a big believer that the interview process is almost the first stage of that onboarding process. It's where people get to know people, they get to know the culture, they come to the office, they get to see where things are happening, and that candidate engagement is hugely, hugely important right at that start. perhaps this can go to the two talent guys with Joe and Charlie. What challenges have you seen to date, and how perhaps have you overcome some of these challenges from interviewing wholly from a remote perspective? I appreciate, particularly in technology, a lot of remote interviewing goes on already, and there's some testings obviously done remotely, but actually the whole process very rarely happens from remote situation. Any thoughts or insights onto that?
Sure. Joe, you go first.
So typically at a trade, we don't so much test for black and white skills. What we test for is people's ability to work with each other, their ability to work on a whiteboard together, the way they take feedback. And a lot of the smaller parts of that are often lost when you're talking over a video. You know, you lose small amounts of facial expressions. There's less to read. Not to mention actually collaborating, not having something to go and walk to and write on is much more difficult when you're so far apart. So we noticed there were a lot of feedback from interviewers was coming back afterwards saying, we're not really sure how they'd react. We weren't really sure if they understood this properly. And we found we were having to make a lot of allowances for how we were doing the assessments or assessing the actual interactions themselves. So our way of combating that was just making sure that we spend a lot more time reflecting and giving the engineers doing the interviews the tools to make more confident decisions and to make sure that, I guess, professionalism in candor over videos was carried out. So they always knew the question was fully understood. So there were less allowances needing to be made. Well, that was a big thing for us initially.
Yeah, I mean, you said you sort of do a lot of whiteboarding and things. How do you overcome that aspect of it? Or have you got some tools that you can use that can...
Yeah, so Google have got their own called Jamboard. A couple of other teams have some other solutions. There is everything from really simple ones where you basically just doodle on a blank canvas to some more complex things where you can drop imagery and add post-it notes, much like you would in real life, where they share real time. So they become really valuable tools. I guess the only issue is the candidate's familiarity with, you know, a new tech tool you're trying to test them with. If there are any bugs or issues with it, all of a sudden it's a whole other issue.
Yeah, no, I get that. Charlie, what about you? Can you perhaps share some of your experiences?
Yeah, sure, Sean. It is a tricky one, and I think it's important to look at it from both the employer and the candidate perspective, both of which can face quite a daunting sort of mountain ahead of them when it comes to this process. From the employer point of view, it's as you've alluded to already, both you, Sean, and you, Joe. How do you compensate for not having that person in front of you in your office and that direct interaction? It's kind of like, you know, how it's a bit like dating without ever actually meeting the person. So you start looking at ways of mitigating against that. And part of that can be using things like, we use something called Video My Job, which is an online platform. Other platforms are available, but you can use that to do things like virtual office tours, virtual meet the teams, just to give candidates that sense of culture, that sense of environment, those sort of indirect but really important factors in any interview. And from the candidate point of view, it's really equipping them with as much insight, as much information up front as possible, trying to ensure that you're really covering their questions and engaging with them really positively and really thoroughly to understand what do they want to get from this process. You know, if they've got an hour and a half on a video conference, what can we do to help them? What can we tell them? What can we show them, introduce them to? And really getting their feedback and insight from the very, very beginning stages.
And you do that as a talent team as part of the first stage of the process, do you?
We do, yeah. But if you take it back a step, a lot of that, there's a close sort of link there to hiring manager education. So before you even think about going ahead with any sort of hiring process, you've got to make sure that your hiring managers are equipped and they're comfortable. So we've done a lot of work putting together playbooks on Page Tiger that we can share, just providing general guidance and support, not assuming that managers are going to be comfortable with this process and comfortable how to do it. So we put together a WebEx interview guide, how to get the best out of an interview when you're doing it remote. So we put together a 2-pager that we sent out, and various other guides, sort of a hiring manager playbook, for example, that just gives them some insightful information about the business that they can share perhaps up front, get candidates feeling comfortable and engaged. So it's working with both sides, to equip them before you even start the process and give them that confidence to go forward and make it a success.
Okay, no, thanks, Charles. Matt, what about yourself? I mean, you know, obviously from perhaps someone who leads more of the technical side of things, how easy have you found that? Is it something you've done sort of sort of the COVID, or is it something that you've had to sort of adapt to quickly and work on the spot, really?
I think we definitely had some tools in place, and we've done this in part remotely, normally for international candidates who couldn't come into the office. Tools that we've used are, I guess the best ones, Visual Studio Code with Live Share is really good, and Miro as a whiteboarding tool. The reason that those tools are good is because of latency. One of the things that Joe raised is that rapport that you get and that feedback loop that you get. We found with some tools, such as Google's whiteboarding solutions, when there's some latency, when it's a bit slow, it becomes a bit awkward, you start to lose that rhythm, and it moves away from being a conversation. So I think that's certainly been part of the learning process. But we've managed to put those tools that we already had together and come up with pretty much our normal process, but now online. I think that's going reasonably well. I think some of the advantages that we've had are we've now professionalized that whiteboarding exercise a little bit more, because it was harder. So we've been a bit more rigorous. We've thought that through. One, I think, thing that we've learned is we can now split up a 3-hour interview process over multiple days or with bigger breaks. So instead of the candidate being in for a block of time, we've now given them a bit more time to relax. We can split it up. They're more relaxed when they come into the interviews, and they're more rested and have time to think. So I think there are some advantages we've found. Some of the disadvantages have been, I think, it's still hard to read candidates and to read their feel. And I think that's led us to slightly less acceptance rate when it comes to candidates accepting, because they're less bought in. They haven't been to see us. They haven't experienced the office. So there's a bit more of a hurdle there. They've committed a few hangout meetings, not a trip to the office, not coming and meeting the team. So there's less buy-in from that. So I think it's the other thing to watch out for. Yeah.
I mean, James, obviously from the candidate experience, I know that you were hired sort of pre-lockdown, but you sort of got onboarded right at the very early stages of the lockdown process. But I know your interview process actually was part remote and part sort of on site. How's that from a candidate experience? Do you feel from a remote interviewing process that you got what you wanted out of this? You felt that you could represent yourself correctly? Obviously you got the job, so you did, but how did you feel throughout that?
Yeah, remote interviews are, I mean, obviously on site, I always find to be much better. I did have an on-site interview. I did go and actually meet people, and to be honest, it does help. But, I have remote interviews now are fairly commonplace. A lot of times you'll have a remote interview, some places I've had remote interviews where I've had like 4 or 5 remote interviews, and then they take you, on site. So remote interviews, I think, are fairly commonplace, and I don't think candidates are overly afraid of them or scared of them. I think it's relatively normal already. Maybe, remote interviews for the whole process isn't that common. But remote interviews certainly are relatively common, and I think most people are comfortable with them. Certainly I am.
Okay, I mean, and Matt mentioned there, both probably to Joe and Charlie there, that they felt they learned something actually from sort of the sort of the remote interview process, and perhaps particularly around the whiteboarding exercise. Is there anything you guys who are living and breathing this now think actually you would integrate that into your sort of normal process and practices when we sort of get out of this lockdown situation?
Sure, Sean. I think from my point of view, sort of a couple of real basic things, one of which is not to make assumptions. Don't make assumptions about your manager's level of comfort with doing this remote process. We in TA, guys like Joe and I, and perhaps others on the call, might be doing this day in, day out, and it's just a familiar part of the job. But to a lot of people, it is slightly alien to do this remotely. So it's working with your folks internally to make sure that they are comfortable, they're prepped, they've got their questions answered, because they may have doubts. And then don't make assumptions on the part of the candidate in the same way. Somebody in James's position, don't assume that a candidate's going to be happy and comfortable to go through your vision of a remote interview process. Goes back to that point I made earlier. Find out what they want. What are their priorities? what's going to be helpful for them? You know, will a virtual office tour help? Will a virtual meet the team help? What can we incorporate into this process to give them that level of comfort that means that when it does come to an offer, you're not going to then come up against hurdles that have come about through that sort of uncertainty or doubt from the remote process. So it's mitigating against future issues by covering them off early. So yeah, don't make assumptions and plan ahead.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. I think, obviously, when do you start the onboarding process? I know we're talking about it at the interview there then, but perhaps you can just talk us through, Matt, you can start off here. You know, you've hired somebody, you've accepted them, you like them, you're confident that they're the right person. What next?
Yes, I think always there's a process between the hire and the person joining the team. I think that's always an important process, and it's somewhere we'll be focusing on more and more over the past year. I think with the current situation, the key focuses are, to start with, they've got to hand their notice in. They've got to decide to move to a different company. That's actually a more scary thing to do right now. And we've already had candidates who said, actually, I've changed my mind. I'm a bit concerned about moving across. So I think giving them all the answers to all the questions they have as soon as you can, even after they've signed a contract. It's never a done deal until they sit down in the office, but I think it's even more important now than ever. High levels of communication. So a couple of things we've done. One, our people team have really stepped up and done more communication about the team, about the building, about what's happening. Not virtual talks. We couldn't do that before we left the office, but essentially more photos and things about the team. And then meeting the team. So we've had, for the new joiner we had last week, the team did a virtual games night and welcomed their new member into the team in a social setting. What we normally do is invite them to a social, a Friday night social we can't do that. So how do we recreate that? He actually said, why don't we enforce that? Why don't you make that mandatory? Because it was so useful. Why wouldn't we always do that? Not say, would you like to do this? Which is what we did in that case. So I think those... Have
we tried that a few times now? Is that just with one candidate?
We've done that with a few people. That was one candidate who said we should make it mandatory. Yeah. I think that depends on the squad that they're joining for us. It's very much getting to know the squad and getting to know the team. So I've asked those teams to, here's the problem, you go and solve it. For one team, it was a games night. I think both teams have done a games night actually, but it's up to them to choose the games and that sort of thing. But maybe we could stand past that.
Okay, and Joe, Charlie, any sort of insights on sort of when you start the process? What next after people have signed contracts and ready to join?
Yeah, so I actually am a big fan of what you said. I strongly believe that pre-boarding is a part of the interview process and the longer process. So at Trey, our talent team actually handle quite a large portion of the onboarding process. So for us, it's a way to continue extending the candidate experience process, which is something we've always been very proud of. So right from, we'll do a virtual tour, like Charlie mentioned, alongside the offer to make sure they're familiar with what the office looks like and where they're going to spend a lot of time. We immediately follow up by getting the team to, go out of their way to introduce themselves long before the start date, the couple of days after the offer's been accepted. Make sure that there's some familiarity with the people they're going to interact with so that when they do turn up and they have questions, they already feel comfortable introducing themselves to people they feel like they can trust and who know them. And then moving forward, we put a lot of onus on the team and the hiring manager to do a lot of this. We have a set of toolkits, Kanban boards, a series of classroom sessions, all of which is related to the onboarding process that we'll get hiring managers to book in advance so that the candidate, again, walks in with more comfort with, knowing what they're going to be doing for the first week, knowing what meetings they need to go to, knowing what success looks like straight away so they can feel comfortable and feel they can trust us to know that we're putting the right things in. Matt obviously highlighted that security is a really big thing right now. And I think through caring, you can show a huge amount of commitment to someone that is really, really valued when they arrive.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, and James, from your perspective there, and I know, your first day, I think, was the day the lockdown was actually announced. So I think Matt makes a really, really good point, and from our experience at Burnshin, a lot of candidates are nervous at the moment. They're probably in a job position, and even if it's a superb organisation and business, change at this moment in time is very, very nervous. People do feel vulnerable. Did you go through any of those emotions, and how did Gamesys potentially overcome those?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always an anxiety when you're a new starter that, am I going to like the job? Am I going to fit in? Will I be able to do the job? Will I like the company culture? There's a kind of anxiety there anyway. You add into that the fact that I could get a virus and my kids are at home and this has all happened really quickly. It did make it quite an anxious thing to do. But in terms of the way Gamesys have handled it, Gamesys have been really good to me. They've kept in a lot of contact. Again, we've got Friday socials, we've got poker tournaments that are going on to keep people involved in that. But from my working experience, you know, working remotely and starting remotely didn't feel like it was going to be a huge challenge. I think, you know, working in IT, I've worked remotely or I've worked with people in different continents before. So from a kind of challenge point of view and starting, that wasn't really my anxiety. My anxiety was, I think, just the sort of thing a person would have when they start a new job. Plus, you know, it's a crazy time as well.
Yeah.
So I think that just everybody had that, right?
Yeah. Has anybody throughout to the panel there sort of hired any more junior people than perhaps some, you know, Matt's a senior technologist and your skill sets are probably easier to sort of plug into an organization. Have you been through the process with any more junior people who perhaps have less experience of moving jobs and also less experience of the, you know, the day-to-day needs of the job?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a couple, Sean, and we're in the midst of graduate assessments. So that's going to be an interesting time. We've had to sort of shift that from, you know, classic assessment days and all the insight you get from meeting these young folks to doing it all remotely. So that's going to be interesting. I think there's a plus and a negative. Plus is, you know, I count myself as a bit long in the tooth now, and the younger folks coming through are so familiar. They're so used to doing things remotely via video links, Zoom, Hangouts, whatever tool it is. It's just second nature to them. So there's an inherent sort of comfort level there. But because you're dealing with, as you said, that lesser level of experience, they're not able to just slot in and hit the ground running. The onus then shifts back to us as the employer to put together really, really thorough, comprehensive onboarding packs. A lot more thorough, a lot more detailed than we would perhaps do when somebody joins us in office, so that that individual has loads of structure, loads of support, all the right points of contact mapped out. They've had sort of FaceTime contact or virtual FaceTime contact with their sort of key stakeholders, and just giving them everything they need to be comfortable and to understand what's going to happen, when and why, to have the materials in advance and so on. So it's sort of, you know, give them as much detail and preparation opportunity as you can.
Yeah, I mean, a big theme of this is coming out. It's all about high touch points, lots of communication. And I imagine that's accentuated sort of the less experience of the starter that you have. They probably need more hand-holding process, particularly about the day-to-day nuances of the job. Joe, to you, so what are the timescales that you think for setting up a new starter now? How long does it take to sort of get things in motion and get things moving?
So, you know, as a small company, we always had to be really reactive. It was the case of like offer Friday, start Monday. As we've grown, we've started to realize that that's not quite as easy. So recently, maybe a month ago, we put in a process where we needed a week, which would allow us to set up those touch points we're talking about, you know, the meetings with the manager, making sure that their kind of onboarding process and their welcome packs were already set before they got here, rather than doing it on Tuesday when they were already there. So we'd already taken a break of agreeing we were going to have at least a whole working week between offer and start date. As a caveat of that, we allow all our engineers to order their own equipment. Apple is, you know, a bit slower these days, so we've made that 10, which is only a small allowance, but it's working okay. The core thing for us is the personalization, making sure we have enough time to get a Kanban board built for each person that mirrors where they are, what they need to know, and the things they're interested in, so they enjoy their first couple of weeks. That's the bit that really takes time. So we have to make sure that the hiring manager has time to speak with the candidate before they arrive.
It's a fairly dry, you mentioned sort of the kit there and technology. It's quite a dry subject, but actually a real issue at this moment in time when, you know, you can't physically go into the office to sort of get a kit. You can't get the software uploaded that you needed to be due. Are anybody else facing challenges around that, actually procuring kit? I mean, I imagine, Charlie, you've got quite a, you know, sort of a big supply chain along those side of things. Is that a real issue at this moment in time? How are we overcoming that problem?
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate in that we had enough kit to see us through, I think it was 3 to 4 months, we estimated based on our sort of hiring forecasts. So touchwood will be okay, but obviously there were some urgent calls with suppliers, urgent sort of measures put in place around, you know, secure ways of couriering hardware. We had to completely revamp or re-engineer our sort of tech onboarding, which would normally require somebody to come into an office. We had to find a workaround for that to get people onto the network remotely from the get-go. But we were fortunate, being a larger business, that we had enough stock to see us through. But I know that's been an issue for a lot of businesses.
Yeah. And Matt, what about you? Have you overcome that challenge, you know, the real logistical bits prior to starting?
It's definitely been a challenge for us for a couple of reasons. One, we probably weren't quite as well prepared with that stock and that hiring plan. We were doing quite well against the hiring plan, so that stock was rapidly depleting. The other is we're doing particularly well as business, luckily, which is great. But that means that we are looking to hire quickly, and we have ramped up our hiring. So we are already ahead then of that hiring plan, and we didn't have equipment. What this actually meant is we have had to have longer lead times for start dates. So even if candidates are readily available, we've had to say, actually, you can't join us for a couple of weeks, and then we've done things in batches. I still think we've done a really good job of the IT team and the people team getting out packs, hoodies, computers all set up. But it has delayed things slightly, and I've come a cropper myself in that we added a contractor in, and I was a bit lapsadaisical with getting a contractor on board, because normally it's go and have a word the week before and we can get them set up because it's a bit easier, but we still use our own hardware. And I had to push that contractor back by a week and a half because it just wasn't possible. And all of our IT is channeled now through our people team because they're in such demand. Because the other thing is, as well as ramping up onboarding, you've now got 100 people sat around London all realising that their back hurts, that they need another monitor, that their cable's broken, that the IT team are all having to support from their houses rather than from the office and from that centralised point. So it's a harder time for them. So it's also about giving them some
support as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, that's sort of really useful. Thanks, guys. What about day one then? Okay, you've prepared everything. You've done all your virtual meets. You've had the high touch points. You've prepared as much as you possibly can at that particular stage. What does day one look like? James, you know, perhaps you start off here. What was your day one involve?
Well, the morning was a HR induction, which was obviously done remotely. Then followed by a chat with my manager, and that chat was a fairly long chat, going through documentation, setting up kind of LinkedIn Learning, O'Reilly books we can go through, Confluence pages, setting up access, which, you know, in a relatively big company can be quite an onerous thing to do. So that takes you, you know, half a day anyway to raise all the tickets for things you need. The raising of requests had not been done for me. That was something I needed to do myself, but I had a spreadsheet of stuff I needed to do. So for the first couple of days, I was kind of involved in just the kind of admin of starting.
Yeah. And was that an easy process? Were you talk through that? Do you have documentation to do that? Was it through video link? How did that?
No, but I didn't particularly need it because, you know, it's got a website where you go on and you say, oh, I want this.
It's fairly straightforward.
And you raise a ticket.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, I would have probably did have help in, you know, go to this website, request this kind of thing. But yeah, it was pretty easy. The first 2 days were fairly relaxed, and then after that, I kind of got into the swing of it. You know, the stand-ups, shadowing people whilst they're doing work. You know, trying to, the biggest challenge for me is kind of the business knowledge, kind of getting the lingo of what, you know, everybody's talking in acronyms. But I don't think that's particularly a remote working thing. It's just, it would have happened whether I was on site or not.
Yeah, it's perhaps slightly harder when you're doing it remotely.
Yeah, it might have been easier for me to ask what certain acronyms mean. But, you know, and a month later, I'm doing releases. I'm hoping I'm a productive member.
I'm sure you are, James. I've spoken to quite a few organisations and what they've done, what they would normally perhaps do in one day, you know, they perhaps extended over sort of a week or sort of 2 weeks rather than having sort of that big one first day of lots and lots of meetings. So perhaps some of the others can share some sort of insights into what you've done around that.
Happy to go. Yeah, so our people team scaled back our centralized onboarding a little bit because it's quite an intense in a meeting room session normally, and that's quite hard remotely on a first day. So we've got a little bit more time with new joiners as line managers and as teams. What we do anyway at Gousto is have lots and lots of one-to-ones to get the context built, to get connections built, and so we've, I guess, over-indexed on that a little bit. So first day included, pretty much the same as James, but slightly shorter, and meeting the team and spending a bit of time with the team. So some of the lessons learned, I think for me, the acronyms, yes, it's harder to see people's faces going, what are you talking about when you're remote? So I think that the amount of time you need to give new joiners just to ask questions has to be much greater than is normal, because they're not happening on the spot, and that's a lesson learned. So maybe half an hour a day to an hour just to give them time to ask questions. I hadn't planned that in for the new joiners had so far. Need to in the future. Lesson learned. And I think then the ability to know when they're stuck and to know when they're having problems is much harder. So that's the other thing, to find those touch points. We have a thing called tech buddies, very common thing. They're the first port of call and it's their priority to help them. But again, they can't be so proactive. They can't look and see, are you okay? And they don't want to be overbearing, because as James said, actually the docs we have are really good. People can spend 2 days just going through them and it's absolutely fine. So I think that's harder. We haven't necessarily found a solution to that, but just being more conscious. And then the other thing I'm really conscious of is, with all those docs, it's easy for a new joiner to stay working until 8 p.m. every night in that first week. So watching and being conscious of their balance in that week, and that they're treating their time sensibly. Yeah. And do you see, is there huge differences from, say, sort of pre-lockdown when you had people in? Are there, is the actual structure or the process of it different? I know you perhaps have more touch points to engage with that, or are you really just trying to replicate that, but just through a virtual environment? Really trying to replicate that with a little bit more, I guess, being deliberate about FaceTime with people. Yeah. Joe, what about you? What's sort of the first week look like for guys at Trade?
So very similar to some points that we mirrored before. The first week is all really about context. So, where their role sits in the organization, context of the rest of the organization, the teams they work with. We tried to keep that first week quite exciting. So we spread that first day's admin over 10 days. And in that first week, we have a lot of sessions with different teams where they'll do technical exercises, digging into the architecture, and even a whole day long workshop and kind of mini hackathon using the trade product to build something exciting. So we try and break up the admin across a series of sessions that are more interactive, that we know are going to keep them engaged. The one thing I think we've added that's been really valuable to some of our junior teams and also to new starters is open Zoom rooms. Certain teams and certain managers will have a Zoom channel open for a whole day. People can dip in and out of when they need help, when they need conversation. We found that to be really valuable, just as a way to.
Has the take-up been good for that, has it?
Yeah, really good. Brilliant. There's obviously too many people staying on there all day having a natter instead of using it for something productive, but that's probably a good sign. But yeah, it's been really well used. I think it gives people a level of comfort that they know they're not bothering someone. If someone's at work, they've got their headphones in, head very down, to ask someone else. And I think people have a tendency to veer away from asking for help when they can't see what state someone's in. But knowing someone's in that Zoom room, you have a lot of comfort with just going straight to them, asking questions, and it means you can get things solved there and then. Yeah.
And Charlie, similar to you, really, is it what sort of day one, week one sort of look like for your guys and girls?
Yeah, not a massive variance from what Matt was describing. Something I'd add is just a real simple but really effective little tool is definitely assign a buddy. Have a buddy system for new joiners if you don't already. Having a couple of people have touched upon this idea that it's quite daunting starting anyway for various reasons. Starting remotely only adds to that. So if you've got somebody who you very quickly become familiar with, you've got a lot of sort of virtual face-to-face interaction with, you get to know them more personally, and having that person as your wingman or wingwoman, wing buddy is absolutely invaluable. I think for all new joiners at any level. So that's a general point. Otherwise, similar to what Matt was describing, we've taken the sort of key component parts of the onboarding process. We've thinned it out a little bit, so it's not quite as daunting on that first day. So that will span over the first sort of 3 or 4 days. But interspersed with a lot of informal FaceTime with key stakeholders, making sure that there are plenty of friendly, familiar, supportive faces for the new joiner. They know who to speak to on what topics, and they're very quickly building up that network. So I think that sort of networking and familiarization piece with colleagues comes a lot more to the fore than it would do perhaps in a more traditional, university-based process.
Yeah. Grasping the culture of an organisation, and again, Jeremy mentioned before, that tends to start almost like the first conversation you have when you're interviewing somebody. Surely there's got to be some challenges around embracing and really understanding the culture of an organisation when it has been done from a sort of a virtual sort of perspective. Have you seen any challenges around that, and perhaps some ways of sort of trying to combat that at all?
I guess the main thing for us, curiosity is one of our really big operating principles. And I know that, operating principles never speak to a lot of real life, but we see that as a really genuine interest between people to get to know the team they're in and what that product does, but also to get to know, what they do at the weekend, what they do after work. And I think a really big miss of what we've been doing so far has been trying to mirror those organic interactions you get, just walking to the bathroom, going to get coffee. And I think it's, those interactions in your first week, 2 weeks, when you meet people and you click, or you meet people that are just really nice to you and want to make time for you and help you out. Those things, those individual interactions, I think are really what build up a culture and will make that great impression. So it's one of the things we've struggled with the most, because the generosity of people here is always one of the things I've loved the most about Tray. So right now, the only fix we have is, we have things like ficas and the Portuguese version of lunch, which just means afternoon tea, scheduled into people's calendars. Recruiters will get into a new starters calendar and almost pick people at random, just stick 4 or 5 coffees in there in the hope that, some sparks fly. But I think, the kind of the miss of the organic interactions around the office has been a real miss for culture.
Yeah, well, I suppose the open Zoom room as well can hopefully contribute to that a little bit. You've got that chance sort of. And before we were talking earlier on, James, like you've been in sort of part of what Gamesys have done is actually get you involved in tribes and squads, which are agile meetings, which are not necessarily the ones you were directly involved in, just so that you can experience other people within the organisation.
Yeah, so I've been in all the other data stand-ups. I've met lots of people. I mean, it's clearly not the same as being in the office. I haven't kind of had that interaction, like you said, where I've gone to a coffee machine and there's people there I can strike up a conversation with. But everybody's been really friendly, everybody's made time for me. So, I think there is an element of missing out. I do feel like I'm missing a little bit. And I also feel like maybe I would make more friends, if I was there. But we're kind of making the best of what it is, really. And certainly within the team, we have a lot of interaction. We have two stand-ups. So the afternoon stand-up is more of a chat. We have a kind of Friday social, which is going on. The wider team have got a poker night, I think this Friday, so I'll get involved in that. So I do see it as a problem, though. I do see it as a challenge for us.
I mean, who looks after that emotional side of the sort of the onboarding part of it? Is that responsible for, the talent team, the HR team, or is that across the piece? Have you formally given responsibility for that? Is there sort of a process in place to do that? Or is that just something that is part of the culture of your organisations?
I think it's just part of the culture for us. We haven't particularly thought it through, but I guess as Joe was alluding to for Tray, when you're in the office, we're very helpful, and that's one of the first piece of feedback people often give is how helpful the team are. So I think that's still conveyed, but I think we haven't particularly thought about owning. I guess I think it's the line manager's job as a line manager, but maybe everyone thinks it's their job, and I guess that's a good thing because then they're all watching out for it.
Yeah, no. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're talking is really useful. Is that softer side of things, the social aspects, or the bringing the culture to life and look at it. What specific formal things have you put in place to do this that perhaps have been different to perhaps a sort of a pre-lockdown onboarding process, or has it really been the softer things that have been key?
I mean, so again, obviously, like Matt said, it often comes down to line managers. We have a few feedback loops in the talent process where they will do a regular catch up with their recruiter the first couple of days a few times. They're quite organic, but we have a team that will make sure they go out of their way to do that. And then in their second week, they'll have like a more formal onboarding process catch up where they'll give us a load of feedback. We've only had 2 people go through that process so far, but the qualitative feedback we've got from those, half an hour meetings to review has been really, really insightful, around the topics we could have included to make sure people felt more comfortable about getting help, things like that. And we've had a few managers who luckily have been really proactive in this. And for example, one of the new starters, his manager booked in a 15-minute call at the end of every day, just to catch up, make sure they were happy, get a sense of how everything was going, if there's extra things they could have done to help, so that if there were problems, they were picked up straight away and they could be dealt with the next day. And I think that's just a way of, probably you're mirroring the organic catch-ups that would have happened every day if they were sat side by side. So I think it's just, putting the person's perspective first and caring and doing what Charles said, asking lots of questions, making sure that you are doing the things they needed and thought they were going to get during the process. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this has been focused on actually sort of the candidates through that, but we alluded it to earlier on. It's lots of people involved with lots of high touch points, and most of us, in the talent game particularly, that's part of the daily job. How are you supporting managers to actually sort of do this? I mean, this is a new experience for the people that are actually part of the organisation as well. Have you had to change your process and your training to actually support managers to actually be as effective as possible during this onboarding?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our point of view, Sean, that was a key thing very early on when we started to plan out how we wanted this to look and what we needed to do if we were going to continue to hire. So we put together, I think I touched on it before, but we put together a playbook, talent acquisition playbook, page tiger document that we put together with everything a hiring manager needed to know. So, I mean, Page Tiger makes it quite nice and interactive. You can put links, you can put digital index. It's just a good tool to use. But content-wise, it equipped them with all of the tools, all of the guidance, simple sort of practical operational things like how to raise a vacancy in the first place. What does an onboarding process now look like? Then a lot of more qualitative stuff, how to sell the organization. What can they be talking to candidates about? What should they be thinking about? And really just giving them a wealth of information for every single step of the process that they can just dip in and out of. Every manager can have that document saved on their desktop, saved wherever they need it. And it just gives them that confidence and reassurance that they've got that information at the click of a button at whatever stage they're at, depending on their level of comfort and experience.
And do you have somebody who's centrally coordinating all this? Perhaps, in the bigger organisation like yours, Charlie, you will have. But Joe, in yours, does it sit with you, or does it sit with a line, or is somebody pulling this together to make sure there's no gaps in the onboarding process?
Yeah, so we have a team that collaborates through the process. So we have a head of people who sits right at the top. The individual recruiters are very, very involved in those high touch points. And then the office manager and myself have some feedback loops in there to make sure that everything's kind of being ticked off as it was. I think the thing that really makes the biggest difference for us is just the ownership the hiring managers are taking. Each one of them is going out of their way in their own way to make sure that every candidate or every new employee is being really helped and aided and feels comfortable. We do have feedbacks and loops in place to make sure that happens, but we haven't had to. And if anything, we're in awe of the effort people have gone to by extension to make sure that people are being helped right now.
I mean, just sort of to all of you, really. I mean, obviously, it's probably quite a daunting process for everybody when this first started, not least you guys. What were your concerns pre this? What were the concerns that you had by having to go 100% sort of remote? Was there anything that you sort of had sort of preconceptions on that you thought, crikey, this is going to be a challenge?
For me, I think it's building up that rapport with a new joiner. I think it's been alluded to already about those foundations that you're setting for the future. But yeah, just building up that relationship and making sure that that's as good as and as solid as the relationships you build when you're on site, and you can really, I guess, see the body language, see the interactions, see what's going on for that person around the office. I think that's the thing that I still worry about. And I don't think it's possible to get as much in this situation. I think that's what we have to work harder at when we return to the office.
Yeah, I mean, and you talked earlier on about, getting that instant feedback from people. Is there anything, and I know it's quite early days at this moment in time, but feedback that you've had, that you've changed the process, that you think has worked better as a direct result of that?
Yeah, and I think just asking for feedback, knowing that might not be so forthcoming, is really useful. And actually, probably half the feedback we got would be there anyway, but just not seeking it so much. And so, I guess, so quickly for people who join. It's normally how's your week gone, and just checking, and people say it's fine. But actually, I've kind of forced the feedback here, and for us, we're not allowing new joiners for our company because we're oversubscribed. That means new joiners can't get a Gousto box, and they can't sign up, so they can't go through the process, they can't feel part of it, they can't get their free box, which we tell them they're going to get. So solving some of those problems, I think, is what I've had to go and act on, and that's been really useful, having that feedback. But it's not something I've necessarily thought of with all the other things going on. Yeah.
And from the candidate experience, James, is there anything that you've been through this process now you'd think perhaps might be done differently, or is it?
I mean, I can't fault the way Gamesys did it. I mean, I joined on the day of lockdown, so they may not have done everything perfectly well, but, no one knew this was well. They couldn't have expected the way it was going to go. So I think from a Gamesys point of view, it's been fine. Again, from a candidate point of view, I don't think remote working's this big scary thing anymore. I think they weren't my worries when I was starting the job. I think my worries were about the normal, I'm starting a new job stuff, and lockdown and homeschooling 3 children. They were kind of more my worries than actually remote working and, will I pick the job up?
Yeah. And have you had the forum to be able to express those? Because obviously you mentioned that if you've got family at home, you've got to juggle, if you and your partner are working, and you've got to juggle homeschooling, you've got to juggle all the other aspects of that. Is there been a forum to actually sort of express that? And
yeah, so there's Teams chat rooms within the data side, the data teams. There's other parents, people are sharing resources. It can be difficult. I think I'm the only one in fact, I am the only one in my team with children, so that can be a bit challenging. But I think it's challenging at the best of times.
And sort of moving forward, the future here, do you think there's lessons we're learning now and practices that we're learning now that sort of post-lockdown we will continue to implement, and the innovation perhaps that has sparked out of this, that you will continue to carry on moving forward?
I think so, Sean. I think some things that were perhaps new as a consequence of this will become habit. The familiarity and comfort with Zoom calls, WebEx video calls, whatever tools being used. I think there's going to be a lot more sort of virtual face-to-face interaction as a consequence, which I think is a positive thing. What I'm really fascinated to see off the back of this on a more general level is whether companies, or how companies adapt or evolve in terms of flexible working. When you look at your more traditional businesses, which are still very much about presenteeism, is there going to be a sort of seismic shift to far more flexible working methods because it's been proven to work? Or will things gradually shift back to the way they were? So that's something I haven't got an answer to, but I'm going to be really fascinated to see.
Anybody else, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think one thing we're going to walk away with a lot is how impressed we've been as a team for everyone to go out of their way to really try and make a difference to this process. The ownership that's come into experience of new employees has been really, really amazing. And a lot of that's been powered by that is the feedback loops. People in the team making sure they were having more regular updates and check-ins with people to make sure they could centralize that things were happening, the experience was good, and problem solving. So I think, if anything, when we go back on-site onboarding will be an even less lonely process. There'll be much more people invested in that person. There'll be many more feedback loops to make sure that feedback's being onboarded and we're making changes and that they're cared for and happy when they walk away every day for the first couple of weeks. So I've been really impressed by the company's ability to react to it.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Matt, anything?
I think it's overall, I come back to an early point. It's the things that we're probably doing now are probably things that we should have been doing anyway, but now we have to take more care because the gaps are more obvious. The questions that go unanswered, the things that aren't documented, the problems that we wash over with I guess a bit of a joke in the office are much harder to outside the office. And so I guess it's maturing that process and professionalizing some of the bits that aren't professionalized, and it's an opportunity to do that, as well as some of the questions in the Q&A around will we be able to do more remote more frequently in the future. And I think yes, we'll consider how we do that. We've previously gone from doing a technical test to not doing a technical test that people do at home, and maybe we can incorporate some of these processes into our process to make it more efficient for the candidate. Although I still value the on-site time, and I still think that's important when people are going to come, if they're going to come to the office day in, day out. It's an important part of that process that we should offer and we should have, but maybe we can make that more efficient.
Thank you. Look, there's just a few questions there from the floor, which I'll sort of just come back to now. Apologies for not mentioning some of them earlier. So one of them is around about, do we stagger new joiners or do you do them as groups? I know traditionally people have put together, like to do them as sort of groups. How have you come across that? Have you drip fed, or are you slowly adding people to your teams, you know, and what are the experiences with both? I know we're probably a process, so, you know, we may not have the volumes of people to necessarily do that, but any thoughts on that?
We're still onboarding people in cohorts across the business. That's not necessarily just in tech. And I think that's still a really good thing to do, because I think it's an important part of onboarding is seeing that you've got peers and people going through the process with you who you can reach out to, form relationships with and talk to. And I wouldn't want to stagger that and lose that by people feeling like they've got a people team onboarding session alone, for example, and that they're in isolation. So I think it's important. I think, you know, a good point that maybe we haven't thought through that much, but it's important there is, how do we need to stagger to ensure people get the care and support they need when onboarding? Or do you optimize by grouping people together in sessions?
It could be a blend of both, couldn't it? Yeah. Some things you will do together as a group, other things have to be done individually, but you know, I imagine it's more efficient to do it as a group if you can.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that, guys?
I mean, we've done it on a smaller scale. So we haven't done a group onboarding. But what we're trying to do is align start dates within specific teams. So if you've got 2 or 3 people joining in the same team or under the same manager, we'll try and group those. Creates a bit more of a sort of collegiality. But otherwise, it's probably because of the nature of our business and the fact that we're hiring in all sorts of different areas, they tend to be, you know, bespoke individual onboardings for the most part.
There's an interesting question about remote interviewing, going back and sort of the onboarding process. So how are the panelists ensuring that the unconscious biases aren't creeping in? Video calls aren't as bad as conference calls, but you can still get the same level of connection with a candidate over video that you can in person. It's potentially easier for an interview to fall back into patterns of confirmation bias, etc. Who wants to have a go at that one? That's a toughie.
I was talking about that this morning. I'm still none the wiser. No, I think there are 2 key things, which is stating the obvious, but I'll say them anyway. One is unconscious bias should be pretty high up on any talent acquisition agenda. I think it's a big thing. It's an important thing. I used to be quite cynical about it. And then I went through a really great unconscious bias training course. And it was really revealing in terms of self-awareness. So I think companies should have that high on the agenda anyway. Any hiring manager should have been through some sort of unconscious bias training, is my opinion. Yeah. I think the other thing we can do to mitigate against it to some extent is just to make sure that any interview process involves 2 or 3 people. You shouldn't be relying on a single hiring manager to run the process and make the decision on their own. You should incorporate a hiring manager, perhaps one of their peers or one of their managers, somebody from the HR or talent acquisition function, and just get that breadth of insight before making a decision.
But do you think sort of the video element of that makes it a more of a challenge?
I think it can work both ways. I think there are things that might be that you won't see in a video interview that might have triggered some sort of unconscious bias, but it can work the other way. I think unconscious bias should be treated the same, whether it's remote or in person.
Yeah,
it should be prioritized. It's a great question, but I think it should be priority irrespective.
Yeah.
I find it,
sorry, go on, Matt.
I should say I find it slightly easier. I think the environment is slightly more sterile. That means you're not being affected by people's body language and things quite so much. I don't really like looking at my notes too much when I'm in person, but actually on a remote call, I can have a much more structured set of notes there and take notes digitally. They can be better recorded. So I think there are some advantages actually that again, maybe we can build on in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, you can the way you structure that and actually record that, and you can physically record the interview. You can go back and look at information that perhaps missed, and it can be a reference point further on the line. Obviously, permissions required. There's an interesting one here, and I've sort of had this sort of come up to a couple of times. Is obviously with the new way of perhaps interviewing people, and perhaps the due diligence may not be as in depth as perhaps people are used to when they're doing it as a face-to-face. Have people changed their sort of probation periods? Are you increasing that period as a direct result because of the way that the process is involved now?
So we have a bit of an advantage with this because we're naturally a distributed team. We have teams across the US. We have some remote workers in Eastern Europe. So moving to this model wasn't something we had to do, but and I know I've talked about candidate experience a lot today, but I think if you're going to put someone in a position where you're saying, we're going to extend your probation period when we're already worried about fears of lack of security, I think that's going to be quite damaging to the initial experience.
Yeah.
I think Charles has alluded to some good points about making sure that the hiring managers feel really confident stepping into an interview process. We should be making sure they have, proficient toolkits to make sure that people are properly vetted before they begin. And the same should go for the HR teams and the people doing those probation reviews. They should be clear what success looks like at any point, regardless of whether they're next to the person or they're on another continent. So I don't think, from my perspective, it would be a very empathetic way to handle the situation.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it does send out the wrong message. And particularly as candidates at this moment, I might be slightly more anxious as to moving at the moment. It would probably, be reticent to move, and you may be missing out some fantastic hires as a direct result of that. But it is a very live situation. I do know people. It's probably more reflective on the interview process and the organisation than necessarily than the individual. So, look, we're sort of coming to the end of time. I'm anxious that you've sort of given up an hour of your evening here, guys. So really do appreciate the time. Thank you very, very much for some really insightful things as to what you're doing at this very challenging time at this moment in time, and perhaps what you will look to implement further along the line. For me, it just seems, the key thing is communication is the key to this. Start the process early, lots of high touch points, and get that feedback loop coming in right from the beginning, just so that you can react, change, and pivot on things that needed to be, spot any gaps that you actually have, and potentially things can there are certainly things which we're doing now that might be part of our sort of process sort of moving forward, really. Anything you guys want to say to finish off with?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think with the touch points, care and security says a lot. I think everyone has an opportunity to really differentiate who their business is and the people in it at this point, and really make an extra impression with the effort you give to the people that come on board. And the same can go for people in the business. If you have people thinking about leaving, but they're treated with immense security and respect, and they see how much effort you're trying to make to other people, I think it can do a whole world of good for the people coming in and also for the employer brand. So I think it's an opportunity for everyone to do even better, and even just to professionalize, like Matt said, but to care more importantly.
Yeah, and show you're caring and go the extra mile, do things perhaps that other organisations will not be doing. Those high touch points definitely, I think, can sort of improve that perhaps security, but also that the understanding of the organisation as well. Well, look, guys, thank you very, very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've managed to take out some useful bits that you can go back and implement when you get back into the offices. If you've got any questions, please do ask me. Becca will give you my details, or I'm sure any of the guys here will be willing to sort of answer any questions for people on an offline perspective. As I said at the beginning, we will publish the video on social media. But well done, guys. Really appreciate your effort. Thank you very much, and stay safe and healthy. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Bye.